When Marcus Webb bought a dead ranch for $3, everyone called him crazy. They said the land was cursed, that nothing good had come from that place in over a century. But beneath the cracked earth and crumbling fences lay a mystery so profound it would unravel a piece of American history that had been deliberately buried. What he discovered wasn't just about missing cowboys or forgotten trails. It was about sacrifice, betrayal, and a truth powerful enough to change how we remember the Old West forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus Webb stared at the auction notice pinned to the courthouse wall, his coffee growing cold in his hand. The paper was yellowed, barely legible, but 3 words jumped out at him like a punch to the gut. Minimum bid, $3. $3? For an entire ranch? At 38 years old, Marcus had hit what his ex-wife kindly called rock bottom. Others weren't so generous. A failed construction business in Denver had left him bankrupt, sleeping on his brother's couch and questioning every decision he'd made since dropping out of college. His hands, once steady enough to frame a house in record time, now trembled when he tried to hold a pen. The ranch listing described it as approximately 847 acres in Cascade County, Montana. No structures habitable, no water rights guaranteed. Buyer assumes all liability. In other words, a graveyard for dreams, the kind of place where ambition went to die. But something about it pulled at Marcus like a fishhook lodged deep in his chest. He'd grown up on stories his grandfather told, stories about the real Montana before it became postcards and tourist traps. His grandfather, Eugene Webb, had been a ranch hand in his youth, back when men still lived and died by the seasons, when the land demanded everything and gave back only what you could wrestle from it. Eugene had died when Marcus was 12 years old, but his voice still echoed in his memory, rough as gravel. Boy, the land remembers. Even when people forget, the land remembers. The auction was held on a gray Tuesday morning in a county office that smelled like old paper and defeated hopes. Marcus sat in the back row, his entire net worth, $247, folded in his jacket pocket. Around him sat a handful of bored-looking investors, a young couple whispering nervously, and one old rancher who kept shaking his head and muttering, "Waste of time." When Lot 47 came up, the auctioneer's voice flattened with disinterest. Cascade Ranch, 847 acres, Judith Basin area, structures condemned, multiple liens cleared last year, opening bid, $3. Silence. The auctioneer repeated it, already reaching for the next file. $3? Do I hear $3? Marcus's hand shot up before his brain could stop it. $3 to the gentleman in back. Going once, twice. $5, someone called out lazily. $10, Marcus said. The old rancher turned around, squinting at him. "Son, you know something we don't?" Marcus didn't answer. He couldn't have explained it if he tried. It was instinct, or maybe desperation wearing the mask of intuition. 15, the other bidder countered, sounding bored. 25, Marcus said, his voice steadier than his hands. A long pause. Then the other man waved dismissively. "All yours, buddy." The gavel fell, sold for $25 to bidder 118. Just like that, Marcus Webb owned 847 acres of Montana land that nobody wanted. The drive out to the property took 4 hours through increasingly empty landscape. His truck, the 2003 Ford with 230,000 miles and a check engine light that had been on since Obama's first term, groaned up mountain passes and rattled across washboard dirt roads that hadn't seen maintenance in decades. When he finally found the turnoff, marked only by a fallen wooden sign that read Cascade in weather-eaten letters, his chest tightened. The ranch stretched before him like a monument to failure. Barbed wire fences sagged between rotted posts. A barn had collapsed into itself, its skeleton of beams forming abstract angles against the sky. But what might have once been a main house was now just a foundation and some charred timber, as if the building had been pulled into the earth. But it was the silence that unnerved him most. Not peaceful silence. This was heavier, expectant, like the pause before thunder. No birds sang. No insects buzzed. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath as it moved across the dead grass. Marcus killed the engine and sat there, his hands still gripping the steering wheel. For the first time since the auction, doubt crept in. What the hell was he doing? He had no money, no plan, no experience running a ranch. He'd bought 847 acres of nothing with money he couldn't afford to lose. But he'd also bought something else. A chance. Maybe his last one. He stepped out of the truck and his boots crunched on soil so dry it felt like walking on broken pottery. The air tasted like dust and old iron. As he walked towards what remained of the barn, he noticed something odd. Deep ruts in the earth, like wagon wheels had carved permanent scars into the land. But these weren't the gentle curves of normal travel. These were frantic, overlapping, chaotic. Like people had left in a hurry. Or run. Marcus knelt down, touching one of the ruts. The soil was packed hard as concrete. But in the deeper grooves, something glinted. He brushed away the dirt with his thumb and pulled out a small, tarnished object. A button. Military style, with an eagle and shield barely visible under layers of corrosion. He pocketed it and kept walking. The barn's remains formed a kind of cathedral of decay, massive support beams that had somehow refused to completely fall, creating a skeletal dome. As Marcus stepped inside, his footsteps echoed strangely, as though the space was larger than it appeared. That's when he saw it. Carved into one of the support beams, barely visible under years of grime and bird droppings, were words. "They promised us home. We never saw it again. 1883. Below it, scratched hastily, were names. Dozens of them, etched with knives or nails. J. Morrison, T. Chen, Samuel Rodriguez, W. Blackfeather, Patrick O'Malley. The list went on, covering nearly 6 feet of wood. Marcus's breath caught. These weren't just names. They were a memorial, a witness. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. The land remembers. As the sun began to set, painting the dead ranch in shades of amber and blood orange, Marcus sat on the foundation of the ruined house. The button was in his palm, warm from his body heat. The names burned in his mind. He'd come here running from failure, hoping to find some cheap land he could maybe flip or lease. But as darkness gathered over Cascade Ranch, Marcus Webb realized he hadn't just bought property. He'd bought a grave. And whatever had been buried here was still waiting to be uncovered. His phone had no signal. His truck was low on gas. Night was coming fast. But for the first time in years, Marcus felt something other than despair. He felt purpose. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Marcus spent his first night on Cascade Ranch in the bed of his truck, wrapped in a sleeping bag that smelled like his brother's garage. Sleep came in fragments, broken by sounds he couldn't identify. Creaking metal where no metal should be, the whisper of movement through grass that seemed too deliberate to be wind. As dawn finally broke, pale and reluctant, he climbed out stiff and unrested. But the morning light revealed something he'd missed in yesterday's fading sun. A path. Not a road, but a deliberate trail worn into the earth, leading away from the collapsed barn towards a cluster of cottonwood trees about half a mile distant. He followed it. The trees formed a dense grove that seemed impossibly green compared to the brittle deadness of the surrounding ranch. As Marcus pushed through the branches, the temperature dropped at least 10 degrees. And there, hidden in the center of the grove, was a structure he hadn't seen from the main property.
A stone building, partially sunken into the earth with a heavy wooden door sealed with rusted chains. A root cellar, maybe? Or a storage house? He pulled at the chains, but they held firm. The lock was old, the kind that needed a skeleton key, and it was welded shut by decades of rust and weather. He'd need tools, bolt cutters at minimum. As he circled the building, looking for another entrance, his boot caught on something, and he stumbled. When he looked down, his blood went cold. It was a grave marker. Not one, dozens. Small, crude crosses made from iron and wood, each no more than a foot tall, arranged in uneven rows. Some had names scratched into them. Others were blank, anonymous. Most were so weathered that any inscription had been erased by time. This wasn't just a grove. This was a cemetery. He counted them, his throat tightening with each one. 37 markers, 37 people buried in unmarked graves on land that public records claimed had been uninhabited since 1885. He photographed each marker with his phone, even though there was still no signal to send them anywhere. Then he knelt beside the most intact one, brushing away the accumulated dirt and leaves. The name emerged letter by letter. Chen Wei, aged 19, gone but not forgotten. The same name from the barn beam, T. Chen. Marcus sat back on his heels, his mind racing. Whoever these people were, they'd been important enough to someone that they'd been buried with care, marked with iron and ground so hard it must have taken days to dig, but not important enough to be remembered by history. He returned to his truck and drove into the nearest town, a place called Judith Gap, population 127, according to a faded sign. The town consisted of one gas station, a post office, a bar called the Dusty Spur, and a combination grocery store and hardware shop that looked like it hadn't been updated since 1975. He filled up his tank, bought bolt cutters, a flashlight, bottled water, and beef jerky. As the cashier, a woman in her 60s with deep-set eyes and calloused hands, rang him up, she glanced at the mud on his boots. "You're the fool who bought Cascade Ranch," she said. It wasn't a question. Marcus managed a tired smile. "News travels fast." "Nothing else to talk about in a town this size." She bagged his items slowly, deliberately. "My advice, sell it back to the county and get out while you can." "Why's that?" The woman's expression hardened. "Because that land's got a bad history. My grandfather used to say 7 families tried to make a go of it over the years. Every single one left within a season. Some in the middle of the night, leaving everything behind." "What happened there?" She handed him the bag, her eyes never leaving his. "Nobody knows, or if they do, they're not talking. But there's a reason that ranch sat empty for 140 years. There's a reason nobody wanted it, even for $3. She paused. "Well, nobody, except you." Marcus paid and turned to leave, but her voice stopped him at the door.
"If you find anything out there, anything that don't sit right, you come back here and you tell someone. Don't try to handle it alone. That's how people disappear." The weight of her words followed him back to the ranch. By early afternoon, Marcus stood before the stone building again, bolt cutters in hand. The chains resisted, but eventually the rusted links gave way with a crack that echoed through the grove. The door opened with a groan that sounded almost human. Inside, the air was cool and stale, thick with the smell of earth and something else. Old leather, maybe, or dried herbs. Marcus's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing shelves lined with objects. Tin cups,
a broken harmonica, folded blankets so rotted they crumbled at a touch. But it was the back wall that made his breath stop. Documents. Hundreds of them, stacked in crates and nailed to the walls in overlapping layers. Contracts, letters, ledgers, all yellowed and brittle, but still legible. Marcus pulled one down carefully, tilting it toward his flashlight. It was a work contract, dated March 1883, between Cascade Cattle Company and a man named Joseph Morrison. The terms were brutal. 18-hour days, payment in company scrip rather than cash, deductions for food and shelter that exceeded the promised wages, essentially indentured servitude. Marcus pulled down another. Same company, different name, William Blackfeather. Then another, Patrick O'Malley. The same names from the barn beam. The same names from the graves. His hands shook as he read through contract after contract. These men, these cowboys, hadn't been employees. They'd been trapped, promised wages and homesteads, promised freedom and opportunity, only to find themselves bound to the company by debt they could never repay. One letter, carefully preserved in a leather folder, was written in shaky handwriting. Dear Mother, I know I promised to come home by Christmas, but they say I still owe for 3 months' board and the horse I was accused of laming. They won't let me leave until the debt is paid. I don't know how I'll ever pay it. The work is hard and the bosses are harder. Please don't worry. I'll find a way. Your loving son, Samuel. There was no date on when it was sent, or if it ever was. Marcus spent hours in that stone building, piecing together a picture that made his stomach turn. The Cascade Cattle Company had recruited workers, many of them immigrants, indigenous men, freedmen, with promises of good wages and land. But once they arrived at this isolated ranch, they'd been trapped in a system designed to keep them perpetually in debt. And when they tried to leave, or fought back, or simply collapsed from exhaustion, the graves. As the sun began to set again, Marcus emerged from the stone building with arms full of documents. His mind reeled with the implications. This wasn't just a forgotten ranch. This was a crime scene, a mass grave, a piece of American history that someone had deliberately tried to erase. He thought about the cashier's warning, don't try to handle it alone. But who could he tell? Who would even believe him? And more importantly, who had gone to such lengths to make sure this place and these people were forgotten? That night, back in his truck bed, Marcus couldn't sleep. Every sound seemed amplified. The wind through the dead grass sounded like whispers. The creaking of the remaining barn beams sounded like footsteps. And once, just after midnight, he could have sworn he heard voices. Distant, mournful, speaking in languages he didn't understand. He sat up, heart pounding, flashlight in hand. But when he swept the beam across the ranch, there was nothing. Just darkness and the skeletal remains of buildings and 37 graves hidden in a grove of trees. Marcus Webb had come here looking for a fresh start. Instead, he'd found a horror that had been waiting more than a century to be witnessed. And something told him that whatever happened here wasn't finished yet. Marcus drove back to Judith Gap at sunrise, his truck bed loaded with carefully wrapped documents. He needed answers, and more importantly, he needed someone who could verify what he'd found. The local library, if it could even be called that, occupied a corner of the post office, 3 shelves of donated books, and a single computer with dial-up internet that wheezed like an asthmatic. The librarian, a thin man in his 70s named Harold Voss, looked up from his crossword puzzle as Marcus entered. "Help you find something?" "I need to research the history of Cascade Ranch, specifically the Cascade Cattle Company from the 1880s. Harold's pencil stopped mid-word. His expression shifted from bored indifference to something Marcus couldn't quite read. Was it fear? Recognition? "That's a name I haven't heard in 40 years, Harold said quietly. He set down his puzzle and stood, moving toward a filing cabinet in the back corner. "My father made me promise never to speak about it, said some histories are better left buried. But I'm 83 years old. Promises to dead men don't carry the weight they used to." He pulled out a worn manila folder. He spread the contents across the counter, newspaper clippings, brittle and yellowed from publications that no longer existed. The Great Falls Tribune from 1884, the Helena Independent from 1885. Each article was brief, buried in the back pages. Labor disputes at Cascade Ranch. A small piece mentioning workers who attempted to leave and were forcibly returned by company agents. Investigation ordered into cattle company practices. Dated October 1884. Detailing complaints from families who hadn't heard from their sons and husbands in over a year. Cascade Cattle Company dissolved. March 1885. A single paragraph stating the company had been liquidated following financial irregularities and management disputes. No mention of the workers. No mention of what happened to them.
The official story, Harold said, tapping the last clipping, is that the company went bankrupt and everyone scattered. Workers went home, investors lost money, end of story. He looked up at Marcus, his eyes sharp despite his age. "But my father was a county deputy back then. He was part of the investigation team that went to Cascade Ranch in winter of 1885. "What did they find?" Harold's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Nothing. That's what made it so damn suspicious. Buildings abandoned mid-task, food still on tables, tools scattered, livestock dead in their pens, but no people. Not a single body, not a single worker, just gone." Marcus felt his skin prickle. "But I found graves. 37 of them." Harold's face went pale. 37? Hidden in a grove of cottonwoods and a stone building filled with contracts, letters, evidence that these men were being held against their will. For a long moment, Harold just stared at him. Then he pulled out a chair and sat down heavily. "My father said something happened out there that winter, something that scared the investors enough to liquidate the company overnight and scatter to the four winds. He said there were rumors. Workers had tried to escape, and when they were caught..." He trailed off. "But there was never any proof. No bodies, no witnesses, nothing." "Until now," Marcus said. Harold nodded slowly. "Until now." He pushed a piece of paper across the counter. "There's a woman you need to talk to. Dr. Rebecca Hartley. She's a historian at Montana State, specializes in labor history and indigenous relations in the frontier era. If anyone can help you make sense of what you found, it's her." Marcus spent the next hour at the library's ancient computer, typing an email to Dr. Hartley with shaking fingers. He attached photos of the contracts, the grave markers, the names carved into the barn beam. His message was simple. "I found something at Cascade Ranch that I think you need to see. History that's been buried for 140 years. He hit send and waited, staring at the screen as the progress bar crawled with agonizing slowness. The response came faster than he expected, within 2 hours. "Mr. Webb, I am familiar with the rumors surrounding Cascade Ranch. What you're describing could be one of the most significant discoveries related to labor exploitation in the American West. I can be there by tomorrow evening. Do not move or disturb anything further. This is a historical crime scene. Dr. R. Hartley."
That afternoon, Marcus returned to the ranch with a new sense of purpose. If this was a crime scene, and it clearly was, he needed to document everything properly. He spent hours photographing the graves from every angle, measuring distances, sketching rough maps of the property. He cataloged every document in the stone building, handling each piece with the care it deserved. As he worked, he found more. A child's toy carved from wood, hidden in a corner of the building. A journal written in Chinese characters that he couldn't read. A photograph, water-damaged and faded, showing a group of men standing in front of the barn, the same barn that now lay in ruins. Their faces were solemn, their clothes worn. Some were young, barely past boyhood. Others were older, weathered by hard labor. On the back of the photograph, in careful script, Cascade Crew, Spring 1883. May God have mercy. Marcus stared at those faces for a long time. These weren't just names on contracts anymore. They were real people, men who had dreams, families, futures, men who had been promised something better and instead had found themselves trapped in a nightmare. That evening, as shadows lengthened across the ranch, Marcus sat on the foundation of the ruined house with the photograph in his hands. The button he'd found on his first day was in his pocket, along with a piece of rotted rope and a rusted harmonica he'd discovered near the graves. These were artifacts of lives cut short. Evidence of injustice, proof that sometimes the American dream had been a lie designed to exploit the desperate. His phone buzzed, a rare moment of signal, a text from his brother. Dad says you're a little crazy for buying that land. Everyone thinks you're crazy for buying that land. You okay? Marcus typed back, not crazy. I found something important, something that matters. I'll explain soon. As night fell, Marcus didn't hear the strange whispers or phantom footsteps that had unnerved him before. Instead, the ranch felt different, still heavy with sorrow, but also expectant, as though the land itself had been waiting for someone to finally listen, to finally bear witness. He thought about the inscription on the barn beam. They promised us home. We never saw it again. These men had died here, forgotten and abandoned. Their stories had been erased, their graves left unmarked on any official record. But Marcus Webb, a failed contractor who'd bought this land for $25, was going to change that. He pulled out his notebook and began to write, documenting everything he knew so far. Not just the facts, but the implications. This wasn't just about one ranch or one company. This was about a system that chewed up vulnerable people and spit them out, then covered its tracks so thoroughly that even their deaths had been erased from history. By the time Dr. Hartley arrived tomorrow, Marcus would have everything ready. The evidence, the documentation, the photographs. And together, they would make sure that Joseph Morrison, Ten Wee, Samuel Rodriguez, William Blackfeather, and Patrick O'Malley, and the 32 others buried in that grove would finally be remembered. The land had kept their secret for 140 years. Now, it was time for the truth to come home.
Dr. Rebecca Hartley's rental car kicked up dust as it pulled onto Cascade Ranch just after 6 in the evening. Marcus watched her emerge, a woman in her mid-50s with steel gray hair pulled into a practical bun, wearing hiking boots and cargo pants that suggested she'd done field work in far worse conditions than this. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. Her eyes swept across the collapsed barn, the dead landscape, and finally settled on Marcus with an intensity that made him stand straighter. "Show me everything," she said. Marcus led her first to the grove. As they walked, he explained how he'd found the cemetery, the stone building, the documents. Dr. Hartley listened without interrupting, her face unreadable. But when they reached the graves and she saw the 37 markers arranged in their uneven rows, she stopped dead. She knelt beside the nearest cross, her fingers tracing the name etched into the iron. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was thick with emotion. "Do you understand what you found here, Mr. Webb?" She looked up at him, and he saw tears in her eyes. "These men, they disappeared from official records. Families filed missing person reports that were never investigated. Communities lost entire generations of workers who just vanished. Historians have suspected something like this for decades, but we never had proof.
She stood, pulling out a professional camera and beginning to document each grave with methodical precision. The Cascade Cattle Company wasn't unique. There were dozens of operations like this across the West, recruiting vulnerable populations with false promises, then using debt and isolation to keep them trapped. But most of them were careful. They'd let workers go eventually, or at least create plausible stories about where they went. "But not here," Marcus said quietly. "Not here," she confirmed. This was different. This was systematic disposal of human beings. They spent the next hour in the stone building. Dr. Hartley examined each document with the reverence of someone handling sacred texts. She photographed the contracts, carefully turned the pages of the Chinese journal, studied the photograph of the crew with a magnifying glass. "This journal," she said, holding up the book with Chinese characters. "I'll need to have it translated, but I can make out some characters. It's a diary, day-by-day accounts." She squinted at one page. "Here, this character means hunger. This one means cold. And this one—" She paused, her expression darkening. "This one means death." As twilight descended, they sat outside the stone building with a lantern between them. Dr. Hartley had filled 3 notebooks with observations, taken over 400 photographs, and collected soil samples from around the graves for potential forensic analysis. "I need to tell you something," she said, her voice heavy. "About 3 years ago, I interviewed a woman named Sarah Blackfeather. She was 97 years old, living in a nursing home in Browning. Her great-grandfather was William Blackfeather, one of the names on your list." Marcus leaned forward, his heart racing. "Sarah told me a story that her grandmother had passed down. William had written letters home regularly until suddenly they stopped. The family tried to find him, traveled to Cascade Ranch themselves in the fall of 1884, but when they arrived, the foreman told them William had quit and moved to Oregon. No forwarding address, no final wages sent home, nothing." Dr. Hartley's voice cracked. "Sarah's great-grandmother never believed it. She said William would never have left without saying goodbye, would never have abandoned his family. She spent the rest of her life believing he'd been killed. And now," she gestured toward the graves, "now we know she was right." The weight of that revelation settled over them like a shroud. Marcus thought about all those families, mothers, wives, children, who'd spent their lives wondering what happened to their loved ones, never getting closure, never knowing the truth. "There's something else you need to see," Marcus said. He led her to the barn, to the beam with the carved names and the desperate inscription. Dr. Hartley stood before it for a long time, reading and rereading the words. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "This was carved as a witness. These men knew they were going to die. They wanted someone, someday, to know they existed, to know what happened to them." She turned to Marcus, and in the fading light, her expression was fierce. "We have an obligation now, not just to document this, but to tell their stories, to make sure the world knows their names and what was done to them." "How do we do that?" Marcus asked. "First, we need a full archaeological survey. Ground-penetrating radar, forensic anthropologists, the works. We need to know exactly how many people are buried here and how they died." She pulled out her phone, scrolling through contacts. "I have colleagues at the State Historical Society, connections at the Bureau of Indian Affairs, contacts at universities across the country. This is going to become a major investigation." "And the land, the ranch." Dr. Hartley looked at him thoughtfully. "That depends on what you want, Mr. Webb. Legally, you own it. But morally, this land belongs to the people buried in it. It belongs to their descendants. It belongs to history." Marcus thought about the $25 he'd paid, about his desperate hope for a fresh start. None of that seemed to matter anymore. "I want to do right by them, whatever that looks like." That night, they camped on the property together. Marcus in his truck bed, Dr. Hartley in a tent she had brought. Around midnight, Marcus awoke to the sound of her voice. She was sitting by a small fire, speaking softly into a recording device.
"Field notes, day 1 at Cascade Ranch," she was saying.
What we've found here challenges everything we thought we knew about labor practices in the territorial period. This isn't just exploitation, this is mass murder, covered up so thoroughly that it took 140 years to uncover. The implications are staggering. Marcus lay back down, staring at the stars through the truck's open tailgate. He thought about the button in his pocket, about the faces in the photograph, about 37 crosses that should never have been forgotten. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl called. The first living creature Marcus had heard on this land besides himself and Dr. Hartley. It felt like a sign, like the ranch itself was waking up, breathing again after a century and a half of held breath. The next morning, Dr. Hartley made a series of phone calls. By noon, she'd secured emergency funding from 2 universities and a nonprofit focused on uncovering hidden histories of marginalized communities. By evening, she'd arranged for a team to arrive within the week. Archaeologists, forensic specialists, historians, and representatives from several indigenous nations whose members might be among the buried. "This is going to get big," she warned Marcus. "Media attention, probably legal battles over the land, definitely political controversy. People don't like being reminded that the Old West was built on this kind of brutality. Are you ready for that?" Marcus looked out across the ranch, this dead, forgotten place that had chosen him as much as he'd chosen it. He thought about the button in his pocket, about the faces in the photograph, about 37 crosses that should never have been forgotten. "I'm ready," he said. "These men have been silent long enough. It's time for them to be heard." Dr. Hartley nodded, a slight smile crossing her weathered face. "Then let's wake the dead, Mr. Webb. Let's bring them home." As the sun set on their second day at Cascade Ranch, Marcus felt something shift. The oppressive silence that had hung over the land was changing, transforming into something else. Anticipation, perhaps, or maybe just the quiet before a storm. Because once the teams arrived, once the investigation began, there would be no going back. The truth, buried for so long, was about to claw its way to the surface. And Marcus Webb, the man who'd bought a cursed ranch for $25, was going to make sure the world listened. The transformation of Cascade Ranch began on a Monday morning when 3 white vans rolled up the dirt road, followed by a truck hauling ground-penetrating radar equipment. Marcus watched from the porch of a temporary shelter he'd constructed as specialists emerged, people carrying equipment cases, survey tools, and the kind of determined expressions that suggested they knew they were part of something historic. Dr. Hartley made introductions. There was Dr. James Chen, a forensic anthropologist from Berkeley, whose great-great-uncle had disappeared working on a railroad crew in 1882. Dr. Patricia Whitehorse, an archaeologist and member of the Blackfeet Nation, who'd spent 20 years documenting indigenous labor exploitation. Tom Reeves, a preservation specialist who looked too young to have the expertise his credentials suggested. And 6 graduate students, each wide-eyed with the gravity of what they were about to uncover. "We'll start with the cemetery," Dr. Whitehorse announced, her voice carrying authority that made everyone straighten. "Non-invasive scanning first. We document everything before we disturb even a grain of soil. These are people, not artifacts. We treat them with dignity." The first sweep with ground-penetrating radar revealed what Marcus had feared and suspected. There were more than 37 bodies. The radar showed anomalies consistent with human remains extending beyond the marked graves, deeper into the grove. At least 53 distinct signatures, possibly more. Dr. Chen stood over the radar printout, his jaw tight. "Mass grave," he said quietly. "They didn't just die over time. This was organized." As the team worked, marking locations with flags and establishing a grid system, Marcus noticed a truck idling on the access road about a half-mile away. It had been there for over an hour, not approaching, but not leaving either, just watching. "We've got company," he told Dr. Hartley. She looked up, shading her eyes against the morning sun. "That'll be the first of many. Word spreading." By afternoon, the truck was joined by two others. One belonged to a local rancher named Dale Pritchard, who eventually drove up to the work site with a scowl carved into his weathered face. "You're stirring up trouble that should stay buried," he told Marcus without preamble. "My family's been in this county for 5 generations. We don't need outsiders coming in and rewriting history to make us all look like villains." "Nobody's rewriting anything," Marcus replied evenly. "We're uncovering what actually happened." "And what do you think happened?" Pritchard challenged. "You think my great-great ancestor who helped settle this valley was some kind of murderer?" Dr. Whitehorse approached, her voice calm but unyielding. "Mr. Pritchard, we're not making accusations. We're documenting facts. If your ancestors had nothing to do with what happened here, the evidence will show that." "Evidence," Pritchard spat the word. "You people will twist anything to fit your narrative. This is about making white folks look bad and getting grant money for your universities. This is about 53 human beings who deserve to be identified and returned to their families. If that makes you uncomfortable, perhaps you should ask yourself why." Pritchard left, but his presence lingered, like a threat. That evening, Marcus received his first phone call on the ranch. The cell tower boost from the team's equipment finally gave him signal. It was a lawyer representing something called the Cascade County Heritage Preservation Society. "Mr. Webb, we're concerned about the archaeological activities on your property. There are proper channels for this sort of investigation, permits that need to be filed, environmental impact assessments. Dr. Hartley has filed all the necessary permits.
Nevertheless, we're prepared to seek an injunction to halt any excavation until a full review can be conducted. This is a matter of preserving local heritage and preventing damage to potentially significant historical sites." Marcus almost laughed. "You want to preserve the site? These people have been trying to erase this place from memory for over a century. That's a serious accusation, Mr. Webb. I'd be careful about making defamatory statements." The call ended with veiled threats, disguised as legal concerns. Marcus relayed the conversation to Dr. Hartley, who nodded grimly. "It's starting," she said. "The pushback. This always happens when you threaten a comfortable historical narrative." She pulled out her laptop. "But we're not alone. I've been in contact with descendants, families who've been searching for answers for generations. They're organizing." By the end of the week, Cascade Ranch had become a crossroads. On one side, the scientific team worked with methodical precision, treating each discovery with reverence. They'd unearthed personal effects, a wedding ring, a pocket watch stopped at 347, a child's wooden horse that suggested families had been here, not just single men. Each item was photographed, cataloged, and preserved. On the other side, opposition grew. More trucks appeared on the access road, locals who saw the investigation as an attack on their heritage. Someone spray-painted, "Leave the past alone" across what remained of the barn. The local newspaper ran an editorial questioning whether outside agitators were trying to profit from unsubstantiated claims about local history. But something else was happening too. Letters began arriving at the ranch, forwarded by Dr. Hartley's university. They came from across the country, from elderly people who remembered their grandparents' stories about relatives who disappeared out west, from indigenous communities who'd lost members to labor camps, from the descendants of Chinese railroad workers, Irish immigrants, and freed slaves who'd been promised land and opportunity only to vanish without a trace. One letter, from a woman named Grace Rodriguez in New Mexico, included a photograph. It showed a young man in his 20s, standing proud in new boots, a hat in his hands. On the back, faded ink read, "Samuel, before he left for Montana, 1882. It was the same Samuel Rodriguez from the contracts, from the graves.
Marcus sat with that photograph for a long time, this tangible connection between past and present. Grace's letter explained that her great-grandfather had left Mexico with dreams of saving enough money to bring his family north. He'd written twice, then never again. The family had assumed he died, but never knew where or how. "Now she knows," Dr. Hartley said softly when Marcus showed her the letter. "After 140 years of wondering, she finally knows." That night, as the team gathered around a propane heater in the largest tent, Dr. Chin shared preliminary findings. The soil analysis suggested most of the deaths had occurred during a single winter, likely 1883 to 1884. Cause of death would require exhumation, but the pattern suggested exposure, malnutrition, and violence. "They were worked to death," he said bluntly, "and when they died, they were buried quickly, hidden away. This wasn't accidental neglect. This was systematic." Tom Reeves, the preservation specialist, pulled up documents on his laptop. "I've been digging through corporate records. The Cascade Cattle Company was owned by a consortium of investors, mostly from back east. New York, Boston, Philadelphia. They never set foot in Montana. They hired local managers to run operations and didn't ask questions as long as profits came in." "Follow the money," Marcus muttered. "Always. And the money trail shows something interesting. In March 1885, right after the company dissolved, several of those investors made substantial donations to politicians, newspapers, and even churches, buying silence, buying complicity." Dr. Whitehorse stood, her shadow long against the tent wall. "Might people have a saying, the earth keeps all secrets until someone is ready to listen. For 140 years, this land kept its secret. Now it's speaking." She looked at Marcus, "And you were the one ready to listen." Marcus felt the weight of that responsibility settle over him like a physical thing. He thought about the $25 that seemed like such a desperate gamble. Now it felt like the most important purchase he'd ever made. Outside, the wind picked up, whistling through the grove where 53 souls waited to be acknowledged. Somewhere in the darkness, a coyote called, another sign of life returning to land that had been dead for so long. The resistance would grow stronger, Marcus knew. The threats would escalate, but so would the truth. And after 140 years of silence, the truth had momentum that no amount of intimidation could stop. Tomorrow, they would begin the exhumations. Tomorrow, the dead would finally get to tell their stories. Marcus stepped outside, looking up at stars that had witnessed everything, the suffering, the deaths, the cover-up, and now the reckoning. "We're listening now," he whispered to the night. "All of us. And we won't stop until everyone knows your names." The wind carried his words across the ranch, across the graves, across history itself. And for the first time since he'd arrived, Marcus felt like the land was breathing easier. The exhumations began on a gray Thursday morning, the kind of day where the sky hung low and heavy, as if the heavens themselves were bearing witness. Dr. Chin and his team worked with painstaking slowness, using brushes and small tools to carefully expose what lay beneath the soil. The first body they uncovered stopped everyone cold. It was a young man, perhaps 20 years old, his skeleton still partially clothed in the remnants of work clothes. But it was the position that made Marcus's stomach turn. His hands were bound behind his back with rusted wire. His skull showed a fracture consistent with blunt force trauma.
"This wasn't death from exposure or disease," Dr. Chen said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "This was execution." Dr. Whitehorse performed a blessing in Blackfeet, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. The graduate students stood silent, the academic distance they'd tried to maintain crumbling in the face of such tangible violence. By afternoon, they'd exposed 3 more bodies. 2 showed similar signs, bound hands, evidence of fatal head wounds. The third was smaller, the bones indicating someone barely into their teens. No signs of binding, but the skeleton was curled in a fetal position, suggesting death from cold or starvation. Marcus had to walk away. He found himself at the edge of the property, hands shaking, trying to process what systematic murder looked like when filtered through 140 years of dirt and decay.
This wasn't history anymore. These were people who'd been killed for trying to leave, for demanding their wages, for simply wanting to go home. He was still standing there when the convoy arrived. 7 trucks, rolling up the access road in formation. They parked in a line blocking the main entrance to the ranch. Men emerged, 20 of them, maybe more, wearing hunting jackets and hard expressions. Dale Pritchard led them, and this time he wasn't alone. Marcus radioed Dr. Hartley. "We've got a situation." The confrontation happened in the clearing between the work site and the new arrivals. Dr. Hartley, Dr. Whitehorse, and Marcus on one side, Pritchard and his group on the other. The scientific team continued working behind them, but Marcus could feel their tension, their awareness that this was about to turn ugly. "This ends today," Pritchard announced. "You're trespassing on land that has historical protections. You're desecrating what might be a legitimate burial ground, and you're destroying the reputation of families who built this county." "We have every legal right to be here," Dr. Hartley countered. "The permits are filed, the land belongs to Mr. Webb, and we're conducting a legitimate archaeological investigation." "Investigation?" A man Marcus didn't recognize stepped forward. He was older, maybe 70, with the bearing of someone used to being obeyed. "My grandfather was an investor in the Cascade Cattle Company. He was a respectable businessman who lost everything when that operation failed. And now you're trying to paint him as some kind of murderer? Based on what, some bones you dug up?" "Based on evidence," Dr. Chen called out from behind them. He emerged from the excavation site, carefully carrying a box. Inside was a ledger, preserved in a waterproof case that had somehow survived in the stone building. Its pages detailed payments, or rather the lack thereof, week after week of entries showing deductions that exceeded wages, with notes like "attempted escape recaptured" and "disciplinary measures applied." The final entry, dated January 1884, reads, "Winter losses, 23, disposed of in Eastern Grove. Spring planting delayed due to frozen ground." Winter losses. As if human beings were nothing more than inventory. The silence that followed was suffocating. Even Pritchard's group seemed shaken, their certainty wavering. "That's fabricated," the older man said, but his voice lacked conviction. "You could have written that yesterday." "The paper is authenticated 1880s stock. The ink has been tested. This is genuine. And it's just one of dozens of documents we found." She turned to address the whole group. "I understand this is painful. Nobody wants to learn their ancestors were complicit in atrocities. But these men," she gestured toward the excavation site, "they deserve justice. They deserve to be remembered. Their families deserve closure." "Justice?" Pritchard's laugh was bitter. "You want justice for people who've been dead for 140 years? What about justice for the families you're destroying right now? You're going to drag my great-great-grandfather's name through the mud, make him out to be a monster based on your interpretation of—" "Your great-great-grandfather was the foreman," Marcus interrupted, his voice harder than he'd ever heard it. He pulled out another document, one Tom Reeves had found the night before. "Benjamin Pritchard, hired in 1882 to manage daily operations, and according to this, he personally signed off on disciplinary actions that resulted in deaths." Pritchard lunged forward, but 2 of his own people caught him. "You son of a—" "The truth doesn't care about your feelings. Your ancestor participated in murder. That's not interpretation. That's fact. And trying to bury it again just makes you complicit." For a moment, Marcus thought it would come to blows. The tension crackled like electricity, men on both sides tensing, preparing. But then a new voice cut through. "He's right." Everyone turned. One of Pritchard's group, a younger man maybe in his 30s, had stepped away from the others. "My name is Robert Chen. My great-great-great-uncle was Chen Wei. He's buried here." His voice shook. "I grew up hearing stories about how he disappeared, how the family never knew what happened. And you want me to stay quiet about finding his grave because it might embarrass some dead rancher's descendants?" Dale Pritchard stared at him. "You're one of us. Your family's been here for... My family's been here since my great-great-grandmother came looking for her brother and decided to stay, hoping he'd come home someday. And now I know why he never did. So yeah, I'm one of you, and I'm saying this needs to come out." The dynamic shifted in that moment. Two more people from Pritchard's group quietly moved to stand with Robert, not a majority, but enough to fracture the unified opposition. The older man, the investor's grandson, shook his head slowly. "This will destroy legacies, ruin reputations. Is that really what you want?"
Dr. Whitehorse stepped forward, her voice gentle but immovable. "Reputations built on lies deserve to be ruined. Legacies built on mass graves deserve to be destroyed. What we want is truth. What we want is dignity for people who died without it." "And what about dignity for the living?" he challenged. "The living don't get to choose comfort over justice," she replied. "Not when 53 people never got the choice to live at all." The standoff lasted another 10 minutes, voices rising and falling, arguments cycling through anger, denial, and pain. But eventually Pritchard's group began to disperse. Some left angry, shouting threats about lawyers and media campaigns. Others left quietly, their certainty shaken. Pritchard himself was the last to go. He stood face to face with Marcus, his expression unreadable. "You bought this land for nothing, and you're going to wish you'd left it that way." "Maybe. But I can live with myself. Can you?" Pritchard didn't answer. He just turned and walked back to his truck. As the convoy pulled away, Marcus felt his legs go weak. He sat down hard on the ground, adrenaline draining away and leaving him hollow. Dr. Hartley sat beside him, neither of them speaking for a long time. "That was brave," she finally said. "That was terrifying," Marcus corrected. "Bravery usually is." That night, the team gathered around the largest fire they'd built yet. Robert Chin joined them, along with the two others from Pritchard's group who'd defected, a woman named Lisa Morrison, whose great-great-grandfather Joseph Morrison was on the list of names, and an elderly man named Frank O'Malley, descended from Patrick O'Malley. "We want to help," Robert said simply. "However we can." Dr. Hartley nodded. "Then help us tell the story right. Help us make sure this never gets forgotten again." As they talked late into the night, planning how to present their findings, how to contact more descendants, how to build a memorial that would honor the dead properly, Marcus felt something shift inside him. He'd come to Montana running from failure, from a life that felt empty and purposeless. He'd bought this ranch as an escape, maybe even as a slow form of giving up. But somewhere between finding that first button and standing up to men who wanted to keep history buried, he'd found something he didn't know he'd lost: conviction, purpose, the courage to fight for something bigger than himself. The fire crackled, sending sparks up into the darkness where 53 souls rested. And for the first time, Marcus felt like he wasn't just witnessing history. He was making it. Tomorrow they would continue the exhumations. Tomorrow they would face more opposition, more threats, more attempts to silence the truth. But tonight, surrounded by people who'd chosen truth over comfort, justice over reputation, Marcus Webb finally understood what his grandfather had meant. The land remembers. And now, finally, so would the world. The story broke on a Sunday morning when a graduate student, against Dr. Hartley's explicit instructions, posted photos to social media. Within hours, the images had spread across the internet. The graves, the bound skeleton, the ledger with its chilling winter losses entry. By Monday afternoon, news vans lined the access road to Cascade Ranch. Marcus stood at the property line, watching satellite dishes rise like strange flowers against the Montana sky. Reporters shouted questions, cameras pointed at him like weapons. He felt exposed, unprepared for the hungry attention that had descended on this isolated place. "Mr. Webb, is it true you bought this property for less than $30? Can you confirm reports of over 50 bodies? Are there lawsuits being filed to stop the excavation?" Dr. Hartley appeared beside him, her expression grim but determined. "We need to control the narrative," she said quietly, "before someone else does it for us." They held the press conference in the clearing, with the collapsed barn as the backdrop. Marcus stood slightly behind Dr. Hartley,
watching her transform from careful academic into commanding advocate. What we've uncovered at Cascade Ranch is one of the darkest chapters of American labor history, she began, her voice carrying across the assembled reporters. Between 1882 and 1884, the Cascade Cattle Company recruited workers, many of them immigrants, indigenous peoples, and other marginalized populations with promises of fair wages and eventual land ownership. Instead, these men found themselves trapped in a system of debt bondage that amounted to slavery. She held up photographs of the documents, of the graves, of the artifacts. We have documented evidence of at least 53 individuals who died here. Many show signs of violence. All were buried without proper records, without notification to their families, without any acknowledgement of their humanity. A reporter shouted, "Are you accusing the founding families of this county of murder?" "I'm not accusing anyone," Dr. Hartley replied calmly. "The evidence speaks for itself. We have ledgers signed by foremen. We have bodies showing trauma consistent with execution. We have contracts designed to create unpayable debt. These aren't allegations, these are facts." Dr. Whitehorse stepped forward. For indigenous communities, this discovery confirms what our oral histories have always told us, that our people who went to work for cattle companies often never returned home. Families have carried that grief for generations, never knowing if their loved ones died, abandoned them, or were prevented from coming back. Now we know. And that knowledge, however painful, is sacred. The questions came rapid fire after that, but Marcus barely heard them. He was watching Robert Chen, who stood at the edge of the crowd, quietly weeping. Lisa Morrison had her arm around him. Frank O'Malley stood with them, three descendants united by ancestors they'd never met but now could finally mourn properly. That evening, the story led national newscasts. Marcus watched on a laptop in the main tent as talking heads debated the implications, as historians weighed in, as the narrative splintered into 100 different directions.
Some called it a watershed moment in understanding the true cost of Western expansion. Others dismissed it as revisionist history designed to tear down American heroes. The arguments grew heated, political, divisive. But what surprised Marcus most were the emails. They flooded in by the hundreds, then thousands, people from across the country and around the world, sharing their own family stories of relatives who disappeared into the American West, never to be heard from again. A woman from Ireland wrote about her great-grandfather who'd sailed to America in 1879 and sent 3 letters before vanishing completely. A man from Guangdong province in China sent photographs of his ancestor who'd worked on the railroads and then tried ranching. His last known location was Montana, 1883. Each email was a thread connecting the past to the present, each one a reminder that history wasn't abstract, it was personal, intimate, still causing pain more than a century later. On Wednesday, a delegation arrived from Washington, D.C., 3 members of Congress, 2 from the Department of the Interior, and a representative from the National Park Service. They toured the site with solemn expressions, asked careful questions, took extensive notes. The congresswoman from Montana, Sarah Bridger, pulled Marcus aside afterward. "This is going to become a federal issue," she said. "There are implications here that go far beyond one ranch. If this kind of exploitation was happening here, it was happening elsewhere. We need to know how widespread this was." "Are you going to support a full investigation?" Marcus asked. She hesitated, and in that hesitation, Marcus saw the political calculation happening in real time. "I need to be careful," she admitted. "Half my constituents see you as heroes uncovering injustice. The other half see you as troublemakers attacking their heritage. Supporting this investigation could cost me my seat." "And that matters more than 53 dead people?" Her expression hardened. "Don't presume to judge me, Mr. Webb. I've spent 20 years fighting for this state. But politics is the art of the possible, and right now, I need to figure out what's possible." She left without committing to anything. Marcus felt the familiar frustration rising, the way bureaucracy and political calculation could blunt even the sharpest moral clarity. But that night brought unexpected news.
Tom Reeves had been digging through digitized archives at the Library of Congress. He gathered everyone around his laptop, barely containing his excitement. "I found congressional testimony," he said, "from 1886. A labor reform advocate named Samuel Bright testified before a committee investigating working conditions in Western territories. And listen to this." He read aloud from the scanned document. "I have received reports from reliable sources of a cattle operation in Montana where workers were held against their will, subjected to violence, and in some cases disappeared entirely. The Cascade Cattle Company, operated by a consortium of Eastern investors, stands accused of practices that violate every principle of human decency. I urge this committee to investigate these allegations before more lives are lost." Silence followed. Then Dr. Hartley spoke, her voice tight with emotion. "They knew. Congress knew in 1886 that this was happening, and they did nothing. The committee apparently voted to investigate," Tom continued, scrolling through more documents. "But the funding was blocked. The Cascade investors had powerful friends, and by the time the bureaucracy sorted itself out, the company had dissolved and everyone involved had scattered." "So the cover-up went all the way to the top," Marcus said. "All the way to the top," Tom confirmed. This revelation changed everything. It wasn't just a local crime that had been hidden. It was a national scandal that had been deliberately suppressed. The implications rippled outward, suggesting that similar operations had likely existed elsewhere, protected by the same networks of power and money. Dr. Chen added another piece to the puzzle. The forensic analysis had identified something in the soil around the graves, trace amounts of quicklime used to accelerate decomposition. Someone didn't just bury these people, they tried to erase them. Quicklime destroys evidence, breaks down bodies faster. This was calculated destruction. The week ended with a massive development. A coalition of indigenous nations, labor unions, and historical preservation groups announced they were filing a lawsuit to designate Cascade Ranch as a protected historical site. The goal was to prevent any development or sale of the land, ensuring it remained a memorial. But the suit also named descendants of the original Cascade Cattle Company investors as defendants, seeking acknowledgement of the crimes committed and establishment of a fund to support ongoing research into similar labor abuses. "This is going to get ugly," Dr. Hartley warned Marcus. "These families have money, connections, lawyers. They'll fight this with everything they have." "Let them fight," Marcus said. He was exhausted, running on coffee and determination, but his resolve had never been clearer. "These people have been silenced for 140 years. I'm not going to let them be silenced again." That night, alone in his truck, Marcus pulled out the military button he carried everywhere now, his talisman, his reminder of why this mattered. He thought about the man who'd worn this button, who probably been so proud to serve his country, only to end up trapped, murdered, and buried in an unmarked grave. Outside, the ranch was no longer silent. Generators hummed. Voices called to each other as the team worked late into the night. News vans idled on the access road, reporters waiting for the next development. The land was alive again, finally, and the dead were speaking, their voices amplified by people who refused to let them be forgotten. Marcus's phone buzzed. An email from his brother. "Saw you on the news. Mom's crying, but she says she's proud. Whatever you're doing out there, don't stop. We've got your back."
For the first time since this all began, Marcus smiled. He'd thought buying this ranch would be his final failure, the last desperate mistake of a desperate man. Instead, it had become the most important thing he'd ever done. The storm was coming. Legal battles, political pressure, attempts to discredit the findings. Marcus knew that, but storms passed. Truth, once uncovered, was permanent. And the truth of Cascade Ranch was finally coming home. 6 months after Marcus Webb bought Cascade Ranch for $25, he stood before a crowd of over 300 people gathered on land that had once been forgotten. The Montana sun blazed overhead, but a gentle wind carried relief across the assembled faces. Descendants, historians, tribal elders, activists, and ordinary people who'd followed the story from thousands of miles away. Behind him stood a monument of black granite still covered with a white cloth. Carved into its surface were 53 names, finally confirmed through forensic analysis, document correlation, and DNA testing that had connected several remains to living descendants. Joseph Morrison, Chen Wei, Samuel Rodriguez, William Blackfeather, Patrick O'Malley, and 48 others, each name representing a life stolen, a family shattered, a story nearly erased. The legal battles had been brutal. The descendants of the Cascade Cattle Company investors had fought the historical designation with armies of lawyers, arguing everything from property rights to defamation. But the evidence had been overwhelming. 3 other ranches in Montana and Wyoming had been investigated based on the Cascade findings, revealing similar patterns of abuse. Congressional hearings had been convened. History textbooks were being rewritten. Marcus stepped to the microphone, his hands steadier than they'd been in years. He'd been asked to speak first, though he'd argued he was the least important person here. But Dr. Hartley had insisted. "You listened when everyone else had made peace with silence," she'd told him. "That matters." "I didn't buy this land planning to become part of history," Marcus began, his voice carrying across the silent crowd. "I was running away from a life that felt broken. I thought maybe I could hide out here, figure out what came next, maybe sell it for a profit if I got lucky." A few scattered chuckles. Marcus smiled. "But this ranch had other plans. The moment I stepped onto the soil, I felt it, something heavy, something waiting. And when I found that first button, when I saw those names carved into the barn beam, I realized I wasn't here by accident. I was here because this land needed someone to listen." He paused, looking out at faces both familiar and strange. Robert Chen stood in the front row, his elderly aunt beside him, Chen Wei's great-great-niece, who'd traveled from California to finally lay her ancestor to rest. Lisa Morrison clutched a photograph of Joseph Morrison, tears streaming down her face. Frank O'Malley held his grandson's hand, passing down a story that would no longer be one of mystery, but of honor. "These 53 men came to Montana with dreams," Marcus continued. "They believed in the promise of America, that hard work would be rewarded, that opportunity existed for those brave enough to seize it. Instead, they found a system designed to trap them, exploit them, and when they resisted, destroy them." His voice grew stronger, fueled by months of anger transformed into purpose. For 140 years, powerful people worked to keep this story buried. They covered up crimes, silenced investigations, destroyed records. They thought if they could hide the bodies and erase the names, they could erase the truth. He turned, looking at the covered monument. But they were wrong, because the land remembers. The earth keeps its secrets until someone is ready to listen. And today, we're not just unveiling a memorial, we're making a promise. He gestured to Dr. Hartley, who stepped forward with a document. Today, Cascade Ranch officially becomes the Cascade Memorial Site, protected in perpetuity as a place of remembrance, education, and healing. No one can develop this land, sell it, or erase what happened here. It belongs to history now. It belongs to these 53 men and everyone who loved them. The applause was thunderous, but Marcus wasn't finished. "We're also announcing the Cascade Truth and Reconciliation Initiative, working with indigenous nations, labor organizations, and historical societies. We're launching a nationwide effort to identify other sites where similar abuses occurred. We're creating a database where families can search for disappeared relatives. We're funding archaeological investigations at suspected locations. And we're ensuring that what happened here is taught in schools, so future generations understand the real cost of building this country." Dr. Whitehorse took the microphone next, her voice resonant with generations of carried grief. "My people have always known these stories. We've told them around fires, passed them down through families, kept them alive when official history tried to erase them.
Today, we're honored that the wider world is finally ready to listen. Today, we remember not just how these men died, but how they lived, with courage, with dignity, with hope that someday justice would find them. She led a blessing in Blackfeet, then in Lakota, honoring the indigenous workers who died here. Other tribal representatives joined her, creating a chorus of languages that seemed to make the wind itself pause to listen. When they finished, Robert Chan approached. His voice shook, but his words carried weight earned through months of grappling with complicated legacy. My great-great-great Uncle Chen Wei left China believing America would give him opportunities his homeland couldn't. He was 19 years old. He wrote letters full of hope, describing mountains and open sky and the promise of land he could call his own.
Robert held up the translated letters, now preserved and published in the official Cascade Archive. His last letter said he'd been hired at a ranch in Montana. He said he'd be home in 2 years with enough money to bring the whole family. He never came home. And for 140 years, we didn't know why. His voice broke. Now we know. And knowing hurts. But not knowing hurt more, so thank you. Thank you for making sure my uncle and the others aren't winter losses in a ledger anymore. Thank you for giving them back their names. The cloth was removed from the monument. Sunlight caught the polished granite, making the carved names seem to glow. 53 individuals, listed with their birth years, their places of origin, and a simple inscription at the top. They were promised home. Now they rest in honor. Below the names, another inscription. These men died victims of greed and injustice. They are remembered as symbols of courage and the unbreakable human spirit. May their story ensure such crimes never happen in silence again. As people lined up to touch the names, to leave flowers, to whisper prayers, Marcus found himself standing with Dr. Hartley at the edge of the gathering. "You did good work here," she said quietly. Marcus shook his head. "We did good work. All of us. But you started it. You could have walked away when things got difficult, when the threats came, when the lawsuits piled up, when it would have been easier to just sell the land and disappear." She looked at him with something like wonder. "What kept you going?" Marcus thought about the question for a long time, watching Robert Chen trace his uncle's name with trembling fingers, watching Lisa Morrison place a small American flag beside Joseph Morrison's inscription, watching Frank O'Malley's grandson ask questions that would be answered with truth instead of silence. "My grandfather used to say the land remembers," he finally answered. "But I think he had it backwards. The land doesn't remember, it witnesses. It's people who have to do the remembering. And if we forget, if we let stories die because they're uncomfortable or inconvenient, then we're complicit in the erasure." He pulled out the military button, worn smooth now from months of carrying it. This belonged to someone who wore it proudly, who believed in something bigger than himself. Finding it wasn't luck. It was responsibility. And once I understood that, I couldn't walk away. Dr. Hartley smiled, squeezing his shoulder. "The world needs more people like you, Marcus Webb." As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, people gathered in small groups across the ranch. Descendants swapped stories. Historians compared notes. Children played near the restored barn, which now housed a museum displaying artifacts, documents, and the full story of what had happened here. The stone building where Marcus had found the contracts had been converted into an education center. School groups would come here, university students would conduct research, families would search databases for their own lost relatives. The cemetery itself had been expanded and properly consecrated, with individual headstones replacing the crude crosses. Archaeological evidence suggested there might be other burial sites on the property,
and investigations would continue for years. Marcus walked to his truck, the same battered Ford that had brought him here, now with even more miles and a new check engine light, but he wasn't leaving. He'd built a small cabin on the far edge of the property, accepted a position as the site's permanent caretaker. His old life in Boston felt like it belonged to someone else. His phone buzzed, a text from his brother. Saw the live stream of the ceremony. Dad would have been proud. Hell, I'm proud. When you coming to visit? Marcus smiled, typing back, "Soon, but I've got work to do here first." Because the work wasn't finished. 3 more potential sites had been identified in Colorado. Families were still reaching out with stories of disappeared relatives. The congressional investigation was expanding, and every week someone new showed up at Cascade Ranch, looking for answers about their own family's history. As darkness fell, Marcus stood one last time before the monument, running his hand across the carved names. The button was in his pocket, but he decided to donate it to the museum tomorrow. It belonged to history now, not to him. "You're home," he whispered to the 53 names. "All of you. You're finally home." The wind carried his words across the ranch, across the graves, across land that had held its breath for 140 years and could finally exhale. Marcus Webb had bought a dead ranch for $25, expecting nothing but empty space to fill with his own emptiness. Instead, he'd found purpose, community, and a truth that had transformed not just his life, but the understanding of an entire chapter of American history. The ranch wasn't dead anymore. It was alive with memory, with purpose, with the voices of people who'd been silenced, but never truly gone. And Marcus, the broken man who'd stumbled onto this land looking for escape, had become something he'd never imagined. A guardian of truth, a keeper of stories, a bridge between the forgotten past and the remembering present. As he walked back to his cabin under a sky full of stars, Marcus understood something profound. He hadn't saved this place. This place had saved him. Today, the Cascade Memorial Site receives over 50,000 visitors annually. The Truth and Reconciliation Initiative has identified 23 additional sites across 7 states where similar labor abuses occurred. Over 200 families have been reunited with information about relatives who disappeared in the American West between 1870 and 1900. Marcus Webb continues to serve as the site's director. He has never sold the land. The story of Cascade Ranch has been included in high school curricula across 34 states, ensuring that future generations understand the full complexity of American history, both its triumphs and its darkest chapters. Chen Wei, Joseph Morrison, Samuel Rodriguez, William Blackfeather, Patrick O'Malley, and 48 others are finally home. Their names will never be forgotten again. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.